Hey all you cool cats and kittens, this is Mr. Mintey. Here to talk to you about the Andy Goldsworthy documentary, Rivers and Tides. This is your video message for today, this week. Maybe I'll do another one, probably not, I don't know, who cares. I know you guys had asked for a lot less of typing on emails because it's really wordy, it's a lot of reading. I understand that, so I am sending you a video message instead in order to cover some of the information that I would be typing at you. So first things first, let's talk about the Andy Goldsworthy video, Rivers and Tides. It's a documentary about a Scottish environmental sculptor, Andy Goldsworthy, who clearly goes out places and does artwork, sculptural artwork specifically, based on the environment around him. So some people think environmental art is more or less about being an environmentalist, being a conservationist, caring about the earth and trying to save the earth by way of doing art. That is kind of part of being an environmental artist, but as I said a second ago, you can clearly see that one of the main points about environmental art is talking about the environment, whether it's about conserving the environment, whether it's about saving the environment, or whether it's about some of the natural things that happen and occur within the environment. And I think Andy Goldsworthy focuses more specifically on how the environment interacts within itself, how the environment has changed over time, things that affect the environment other than himself, and some of the sculptural artwork that he makes highlights that. So let's get into that. The first part of the documentary, you see and you hear him talking a lot about sheep, and he compares sheep to the idea of being a river where they flow through the environment in their own way. And because of that river of sheep, the environment, as he talks about, he says it looks bare, there's no trees. He talks about sheep having a very deep impact upon the land, and so that's relative to the environment in that there are certain things that aren't normally part of a specific environment that are introduced into environment that change the landscape and change the scope of the environment over time. And so he does a lot of artwork with sheep. So one thing he does is he takes some of the sheep fur, the Sherpa that's fallen off some of the sheep, and makes a little river, this little lined river of Sherpa going throughout the environment. He covers things in the environment with the sheep fur in order to kind of highlight the idea that sheep, because of their impact on the environment, have erased certain natural things that would normally exist in an environment from the environment with their mere existence there. And then the other thing about some of the artwork that he does is the time that he takes to do the artwork, and the time it takes to interact with his artwork is reflective of the time that the sheep, being a river through that environment, have changed the environment, how long their impact has lasted. Okay, so it's an over time thing. It's environmental impact over time from a non-natural thing, being the sheep living in the area because shepherds put them there to have them eat the grass and eat the land and grow and multiply so they could use their meat and use their fur for products and for sale. And it's how they have changed that environment and how the environment is not the same and would never be the same because the impact of the sheep there. And again, they're kind of like a river. They're kind of like a river where they flow through, and as they're going through, they're kind of slowly destroying the edges of what they touch, and that river becomes wider and wider, and it erodes the soil. So the sheep become and are able to grow more and more and spread out more and more as they destroy the land around them. In the video, he talks about how it's like people were moved out of that area, people who would interact with the land in a certain way so that way they could put more sheep there. And again, there's an absence in the landscape because of the impact of the sheep on said landscape. And if you notice the scene itself, it's a big open kind of valley kind of area where there's not a lot there except for random rocks here and there, and then a bunch of grass. And that's because that's what the sheep need, are big, wide open spaces. So as they multiply, they can take up more space. And as they take up more space, they have food to eat, being grass. Then you see that he kind of moves on and makes these rock kind of circles and these rock kind of like arches And he says things, so he says, people live, worked, and died here, and I can feel their presence in the places I work. And I am the next layer upon those things that have happened already. So part of the idea of him being an environmental artist is that the environment has already created things on its own. The environment has already created these landscapes and these sculptures and these mounds and these piles of things. And so what he is doing is he is using those items that already exist in the environment and repurposing them, reimagining what they could be or what they could look like. He's adding to the history by creating something new out of something that already exists, giving it a new point in history to go from. So again, it's this whole idea of time, is that over time, things change, things shift, things are, and their story exists within the environment around them. And so he's adding the next chapter to that story by doing something purposeful in an artistic way with the items that already exist there, being the rocks and the bricks and stuff and the stones that were probably part of a wall, part of a home, part of a fence, part of a border, something like that. The next thing you notice with him is after he does that stuff, he goes into the woods and he's sitting there by himself at this tree, taking this straw lattice and taking thorns and just kind of poking and attaching thorns together, making this weird kind of like web of latticed straw hanging from this tree. And he says the lattice doesn't need him, so the environment doesn't need him to be there and do environmental art, but he needs it. He needs it for its material, for its inspiration, and for its utility in order to make the sculptures that he does. And he talks about going off into the woods, being by himself. He doesn't really know what's going on. He's just figuring stuff out as he goes. He says it's weird when he doesn't do this kind of art, because when he's giving lectures about the art that he's doing, but he hasn't done the art in a while, he almost feels like he's talking about something that was in the past, something that isn't really part of his current chapter in his life anymore. So again, it's this idea of time. And so for him, he needs to be on his own doing this work to continue building upon that story. He says he likes being himself. He says he doesn't really like people that much. They're draining to him. And so for him, he chooses to work with the environment instead of working with other people. And that's an important aspect too, because especially right now, we are isolated. We are stuck in our homes with the people who are allowed to be around, which is our family, which is our close neighbors who are kind of quarantining with us, if that's the case. Some of you with significant others, I mean, that kind of stuff, right? We're kind of stuck with the people we're allowed to be stuck with because we know what to expect from them in terms of health and infection and all that kind of stuff. So for him, he says that's very draining to have to be that, so he would just rather be by himself altogether and focus on the art. And maybe for him that helps him to kind of like clear his head, focus on his thoughts, whatever. He then talks about having someone in his family dying, which is why he did this tree kind of artwork. And then if you notice in the video, it just kind of cuts itself off like really quickly like that. That wasn't as really stuck with me, other than that he is doing environmental art based on what's happened in his own personal environment. So in his own personal life, he experienced loss. So as he's out in the woods doing artwork, he is thinking about that loss and doing artwork to represent the ideas and the feelings that he felt when he experienced loss. So he talks about this hole in a tree being kind of black hole, where it's like it's the passageway between the living and the dead. It's a little kind of confusing, but I do understand that, like, thinking about that kind of stuff, thinking about death, thinking about this kind of terrible situation that we're in, you get sucked in, you get drawn in, you get lost in thinking about it, and that these things are never going to happen and my life will never be the same, and why can't we just go back to normal? And so he compares that to leaning over a cliff and looking into the deep black darkness of the water and being drawn into it, which happens, you know, you're looking into this deep vast ocean and you kind of wonder what's in there, what's going on in there, and you start getting caught up in that thought process. Then he says something as it moves on to the next kind of part, where he makes this wall, this big long wall. He says there's a sense of movement that is very important to understanding the sculpture. all of the movement, the passage of people, the movement of the wall, the river of stone as it runs around the trees, the river, it's a vein that runs through the world. So he does two things. One, he builds this stone wall that like kind of moves and undulates like a river. It goes around trees. It goes in the water and back out of the water. It goes over the landscape, but there's holes and breaks in the wall that he makes. That way cattle and people can pass through. And then he has this line of red stuff that he found out there that he makes this vein, basically. And it's this whole idea that it's like the river doesn't destroy everything in front of it. It kind of works with the environment as well. Kind of like the sheep. The sheep aren't there to completely obliterate the environment. They're there to kind of work in and around the environment while kind of like going through it. So this is what he's doing with this wall. And if you look at the wall is a big, long, massive stone wall that he built. And it's quite impressive that he's able to put the time into making this wall. Now, another thing that I haven't talked about yet is the idea of the tide. And so river is something that goes through an environment and interacts with it, whereas a tide is something that comes into an environment and takes things out and washes away. And so with the difference of sheep being in a place and with the difference of people being in a place, they come in and live in an environment, and as soon as they leave the environment, they take things away from it. Now, it's not that they remove them from it, those things don't exist. It's more the idea that they kind of move them somewhere else. And so that's something to think about with his art, is this persistence of time, is that weathering natural occurrences like wind, like water, like erosion, that kind of stuff. He makes these sculptures and these tides of different environmental aspects come in and affect the artwork, and as they go out, they change it. And they take those kind of details of what the artwork used to be and pull it to a different place. So it's the idea of that. It's not gone forever. It's just been moved somewhere else, which is kind of like him. He's like a tide. He comes into the environment, shifts things around, and then leaves that environment. Sorry, it's pretty windy out here in my backyard, so it's blowing my papers around, which is it's like what I'm talking about the art. The wind is a factor that's affecting my ability to do what I'm trying to do. There's also all these little like bugs all over this. Well, it's a table that I'm on, and if you see the markings on that table, those are little mites or bugs or whatever that keep walking on my paper, and because I don't like them, I smash them and squish them, and I'm making these stains on this paper. It's very creative. It's very artistic. I'm sure you love it. Let's move on. Then he starts doing all this stuff with the rocks. He finds these little red rocks, he smashes them up, he puts them in the river, he makes these bombs of the powder that he dries up and throws in the river, and then they explode and make these big red splashes. And he's saying it's compared to blood because we have iron in our blood, and there's iron in these rocks, and it's in the water, and he's trying to point out that it's like we're connected, right? We have similar things that are in us, that are in the environment. So it's like when we go in and affect the environment, you know, we're doing things that are relative to our own being because we're kind of part of it. And then he talks about the color red, which is a little bit of color theory, that red is supposed to be a bright, vibrant, intense color. And he's talking about there's this energy and violence in the color red, which makes sense because when you look at a lot of artwork that have a lot of red, a lot of these red things are really intense, really action-packed. A lot of scenes of war use a lot of red. The blood is red. So it's all kind of relevant. And then he talks about how it's in him and it's in the environment. Let's see, what else is he saying? There's some other stuff that he says where it's kind of, it's interesting that he says it, and why he says it is interesting as well. He says there's a real shock at seeing that color, something very alien. So he's talking about how it's just like shocking that when you're in the river and then all of a sudden you find these bright red rocks, these rocks that when you smash up and throw in the river, dye the entire river red. So it's something that's like you don't realize is there, but it's there. And so when it does show up in the river, it almost like shows up unannounced and unexpected, and it's very surprising. He talks about splashes, and he talks about the stone. He talks about the stability of stone and rock, which is kind of interesting itself. It says we set so much of our idea on the stability of stone, and when you find the stone itself is actually liquid and fluid, it undermines my sense of what it is. So we think of rocks, rocks, right? As solid, as permanent, as very tough. But then you realize the mineral and chemical and whatever kind of composition of the rock is a slow-moving fluid and liquid. And when you think about liquid and water, you don't think about it as very tough or strong or durable. And so it kind of throws off your ideas what's permanent and what's not permanent. And again, it's this idea that when you do this kind of environmental work that he does, it's not meant to be there forever. It's not meant to last throughout all of time. It can change over time. Then he does this whole thing with the building, and the only thing that I think is important about this is, well, I'll say two things. One is he wanted to make sure the materials that he used to do the big clay wall were from the area that he was working, and that's a key factor when it comes to environmental art, is working with the environment around you, as opposed to importing something that has nothing to do with the area that you're working in and making an artwork that's supposed to talk about that area. The other thing that he said that I found interesting is that as the clay dries on the walls, speech impediment, you know me. Too much spit in my mouth. These cracks form on the surface, and what he pointed out, which was very interesting, is that the cracks aren't there because of the clay. The cracks are there because the building he's working on, the wall that he's working on, has a certain predetermined structure to it because of how it was built, where the nails are. And those nails and those beams that are in the wall create the cracks from behind to the surface. And so he's talking about, again, this idea of time and a history already existing there, and that him as a sculptor, an environmental sculptor, going in that area is adding to that. And in adding to that, sometimes the history that exists prior and before in the artwork affects the new things and the new additions that he makes to the art that he's doing in the area. So, last thing, he talks about stones being alive, which is the idea of water. Water is living. He talks about a volcano being alive, and you think of the molten lava that's in a volcano being very alive, splashing around, hot, full of energy, bright red, and then it becomes a rock. All that life is still in that rock. It's just moving slower, and it's kind of trapped for the time being. And then something to kind of sum up what it's like to be an artist like him is he has a hard time talking about his work and defining it. And he feels that his artwork does a better job. So when you're talking about doing art, and art's supposed to have a narrative and supposed to speak about something, the art is supposed to do most of the talking. And it's up to the person viewing the art and interacting with the art for them to have the experience and create definitions as to what the art's actually saying and what it means to them. So I thought that was very good. So what I got from this in summation is that there's all these things that people do when they're doing environmental art where they interact with the environment in order to create something that says something about the environment. Because it's environmental art, because it's outside, because it's exposed to the elements, there's this big aspect of time, right? Time changes the artwork. Time influences the artwork. The time that it takes to do it versus the time that the artwork actually lasts. And this artwork is often temporary because it doesn't last forever, is a big key factor in understanding Andy Goldsworthy's work as an environmental artist. Then there's the idea of the tide itself, is that some of these environmental factors that affect the work are constant. They're always going and flowing, just like a river. But some of the things that affect and change his work, sorry, there's a bug that's flicking at it, are like a tide where they just come in and then they go away. And then another tide comes in and goes away. And every time one of these tides comes through and interacts with the artwork, it alters it slightly. And it takes some of those things with it from the original artwork and moves it to a different place, almost like it's spreading out and rearranging the artwork in a natural way. So that is my analysis on Rivers and Tides, the Andy Goldsworthy documentary about his work. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I will explain the assignment typed in the email itself.